Hello, everybody. This is Gary Matheny, the host and originator of the YouTube channel Liberty Observatory. You can find me on YouTube. You can find me on Facebook. And today we're going to have episode 14 of Liberty Observatory. And we're going to discuss today the strong hand versus the free hand. The strong hand versus the free hand. And basically, we're going to talk about it in the context of comparing and contrasting and make a few political observations as well. So let's go ahead and jump in and start with the strong hand. What do we mean by the strong hand? Well, the strong hand is the hand of government that has strong leadership or authority. This was recognized by Plato, Greek philosopher. He was an advocate of the strong hand. You needed to have a strong hand, strong leadership, in order to establish an orderly society and make that society as effective and efficient as possible. It took a strong hand to do that. Now, I don't think Plato at any time ever advocated a tyrant, ruthlessness, but he thought that strong leadership was important for a strong society. So philosophically speaking, at least from Plato's perspective, the strong hand was necessary and important for a well-functioning society. Now that has traveled down through time and many centuries, starting before Christ and up to the age of revolution, the age of reason, rationalism, where the democracies started to take the fore, or what I call the flip of the democracies, where the strong hand of the state took the fore. You had an era where you had monarchists, and monarchists were a form of the strong hand. Derived from monarchies is the concept of the divine right of kings, and we've discussed this elsewhere, where basically the strong authoritarian hand of the monarchy was given those rights and obligations by God. It was the divine right of kings. God had put them in that position to be monarchical, and they were the leaders. They were appointed by God, and it was up to the people to submit to God, or I should submit to the king because he had a divine right to rule. An illustration of the strong hand. Now, I think in our century and in the 20th century, because it sneaks up on you, we have the ruling elite are the bureaucrats, and that can be described as the state ruling with a strong hand, with a bureaucratic, elitist form of government that dictates further and further into the affairs of the population and winds up ultimately exercising a great deal of authority over the people. And so basically, if we talk about it in terms of ruling elites, our bureaucrats, that's the current trend in history. And so we're not so much stuck in the divine right of kings. We're more now in the current era dealing with the power of the state and with ruling elites And those ruling elites can be elected or not elected. Bureaucracies sometimes even surpass elected officials. They become so entrenched. And so one of the speculations that has occurred in modern America is whether we are moving from the free hand to the strong hand. In other words, are the ruling elites becoming so powerful that America is transitioning to the strong hand? And so that's a question. It's open for debate, and maybe we'll discuss it a little bit today or down the road. But in America, there's huge bureaucracies now at every level, local level, county level, state level, federal level. And there's all kinds of other types of boards and administrations, utilities, fire protection districts, and public school districts, all these governing and taxation districts on top of all the elected officials and the underlying bureaucracies that prop everything up. And that I'm not saying they're all wicked or evil or need to be done away with. I'm just saying it is huge. It is huge by the time you stack it on top of each other and put it on an American shoulder. And so basically, if you can refer to the ruling elite in Washington in the most cynical terms, the reference is the swamp. And the swamp came popular during the 2016 election cycle when Donald Trump ran for president. And of course, it was the same issue among other issues in 2020, where the bureaucracy, the ruling bureaucracies, were perhaps their power surpassed even elected officials, including presidents. And an example of the ruling bureaucracies, or the swamp as it's referred to, is that some of these bureaucracies tip the scale in the favor of one group of people versus another group of people. And their function becomes weaponized. And what that weaponization involves is ignoring or explaining away the issues associated with a favored group and persecuting and prosecuting and hypercritical of a disfavored group. In other words, they have put their hand on the scale to favor one group of citizens over another because of political motivations, ultimately power. So think in terms of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, the Department of Justice, DOJ, Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, Americans' version of the SS, Secret Service. And just to give you a minute example of what recently has happened, I'm speaking in August 2024, and last month there was an assassination attempt on Donald Trump. And if you look at the Secret Service agents that are assigned to President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, and then look at the Secret Service agents that are provided for Donald Trump and Vice President candidate J.D. Vance, there's a difference. There's a difference in their size. If you look at the Secret Service agents assigned to President Biden, they're huge, big men, the top of the line protectors within the Secret Service. And then if you look at the Secret Service agents that were assigned to Donald Trump in the assassination attempt, they're much smaller. They're much more rounder. And one Secret Service agent struggled. You can see it in the video of holstering her gun, and so basically, you can see that on a minute level, and you can see it on a much, much, much larger level and more powerful level, where certain instruments of government, certain bureaucracies, certain swamps have taken sides when it comes to political life in the United States of America. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples, extreme examples of the strong hand. And of course, we all like to throw Adolf Hitler in that mix, and we should. We know so much more about Adolf Hitler than we do Joseph Stalin, who was his mirror image in certain respects in the Soviet Union, because both of those men were strong hands. Both those men were ruthless and entirely oppressive, and should have never gained power, but they did. And so we'll have to analyze that at some point. How did these guys come to power? Because they were so ruthless. Maybe that's why they became powerful, because they were so ruthless. Anyhow, let's just talk a little bit here about Adolf Hitler. So his political star started rising in the 1930s. At that time, there was a huge depression going on, worldwide depression, including the United States. And if you go look at some of the video archives, you can probably find them on YouTube. There are people in Germany that are literally pushing around barrels of money. The German market so deteriorated in value that people were pushing around barrels of money to go grocery shopping. It was totally out of sync, and they were struggling. They had come out of World War I, and that left a lot of bitter feelings. Not only did they have their own destruction associated with World War I, as far as manpower, infrastructure, other things, buildings, equipment, etc., and etc. Tons of value, tons of wealth were lost in Germany in World War I, and it happened elsewhere in World War I as well, like France. But anyhow, the Treaty of Versailles ended World War I, and basically, per that treaty, the Germans had to make restitution to the Allies, which seems just at a certain level. So not only did they have the struggle rebuilding their own infrastructure, their own society, but they were having to pay for the rebuilding of the Allies, who suffered very much loss of wealth, loss of blood, associated with World War I. So at a certain level, it was justice. You started a war against us, and there was destruction, and now you got to pay for all of it. But anyhow, suffering in the midst of a depression with restitution was a difficult struggle for the German people. And I'm not saying that to justify the rise of Adolf Hitler. Their democratic processes, their democratic history wasn't strong, and it was failing right and left because inflation was out of control. They were still struggling with the effects of World War I and rebuilding. And so there are multiple layered issues associated with 1930s Germany. And here comes the strong man. The strong man is Adolf Hitler. And he spoke hope to the German people. He scapegoated the Jews for the German people. He spoke about a beautiful Aryan race that was somewhere out there in antiquity that, in my opinion, never existed in virtuous form. Maybe it existed. I guess you do have blonde-haired people with blue eyes, and God bless blonde-haired people with blue eyes, but you can't say that there was this mystical, great society that was made up of Aryan people somewhere in history. I mean, you can talk about the Romans, you can talk about the Greeks, you can talk about the Macedonians, you can talk about the Carthaginians, but good luck finding a huge impact in history by the Aryans. So anyhow, it was baloney. But the people bought the baloney because it was wrapped in a nice package with racial and national superiority. And there were other issues going on. At that time, there was a huge struggle between socialists, and I've caught flack because I've referred to the Nazis as National Socialists. Hey, they're socialists, and they did a lot of things that had a kind of like socialist perspective. Like they were very early on the Autobahn, the highway system in Germany. The Volkswagen Beetle was the people's vehicle, and so a lot of programs and money was spent to further this concept of a national community. A lot of propaganda was used to prop up national pride. And so the German people, by and large, bought into it. And of course, there were intellectuals, there were professionals, business leaders. Why did they sit on the sideline and let this happen? Why did they let the Nazis ascend to power? Well, there's a variety of reasons for that. Part of it may be the inchoate or the intrinsic anti-Jewish feeling that largely went unspoken, but still existed for generations prior to the rise of the Nazis. For some business people, it was good business. In other words, they could get some of these Nazi contracts that expanded their ability to make a profit. And some of them became Nazis not because they were idealists, but because there was something to be gained by becoming a Nazi. And then you also have this this concept that, and I've read about this, that a lot of intellectuals, others in leadership that just yielded to the Nazis, thought that there was just a lot of blather espoused by the Nazis and Adolf Hitler. In other words, they just thought it was baloney. It's baloney. It's never going to go anywhere. It's never going to go anywhere. And then they have Kristallnacht, and the people take to the streets and destroy Jewish businesses and destroy the lives of many Jewish people, killing many and starting the process of hurting them up and putting them in camps. So, the strong hand of Adolf Hitler. Now let's move to another strong hand, Joseph Stalin. We don't know a lot about Joseph Stalin because for some reason he's not as interesting as Hitler. And yet he was just as ruthless. I mean, I would probably have to flip a coin as to who I would say was more ruthless in the early 20th century. Was it Adolf Hitler or was it Joseph Stalin? I don't know. Joseph Stalin did purges where whole groups of people were exterminated. He did executions, and his executions were really interesting because in his purges, anybody that had any semblance of competition to Joseph Stalin for the supreme power of the communist government in the Soviet Union got purged. In fact, if you've read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago about the history of the Soviet Union within Russia, basically he said that good communists, dedicated, consecrated communists, probably more dedicated to communism than many Christians are dedicated to their religion. But they were a threat to Joseph Stalin, who had some paranoia and may have actually been schizophrenic, but who knows? I don't know. But anyhow, these purges killed off these dedicated communists. And they have examples of dedicated communists who are being killed by other communists under the authority of Joseph Stalin, apologizing for not being good enough communists. And so think about that for a moment. You know, here you are, you're a dedicated communist, and your fellow communist is executing you, and you're apologizing for not being a good enough communist. And I'm thinking to myself, how do you get there in your mind? Don't you really think to yourself that communism is baloney? It doesn't work. It's tyranny. It's ruthless. It executes decent people for unknown or unexplainable reasons. And I'm one of them because I'm a good person, and my definition of a good person was to be a communist. The hell with communism. That's what you should be thinking. But no. You're standing in a firing line, get ready to be killed, and you're apologizing for not being a good enough communist. There's another example that Stalin had so much control over the Communist Party and the people in the Soviet Union in general that when he had his public events and he would be a speaker, and he, of course, he'd be the keynote speaker, you know, the most important person to speak in the evening. And so they had these huge events in these huge halls or convention centers, whatever they called them back then. And Joseph Stalin would be announced, and he'd walk up to the podium to speak. And it'd be the whole hall would be full of people clapping, standing up and clapping. Here's Joseph Stalin, our leader. Our revered leader. Stand up and clap. Stand up and clap. Stand up and clap. You know you live in tyranny when you start looking around the hall at everyone clapping, and you're afraid to be the first to stop clapping. You look around, you don't want to be the first to stop clapping. And so there are historical notes that say that people would clap like up to 45 minutes while Joseph Stalin was waiting to speak, standing at the podium. And he probably loved every minute of it. He loved the adoration, and the communists were willing to give that to him. And yet, what type of government is it where you look around and you don't want to be the first person to stop clapping? So, Joseph Stalin. If you've ever seen the movie Mr. Jones, it has to do with the mass starvation, primarily of Ukrainians. And this would go back to the 1920s, 1930s. I think it would be before the start of World War II, but it could have also been during. And what Joseph Stalin would do is that he would go to like Ukraine or other areas of the Soviet Union orbit where there was productive farmland. And he would take whole trains of grain and transfer it to Moscow or other favored places within the Soviet Union. And so if you were kind of like an outlier like Ukraine, or if you were an area of resistance within the Soviet Union, they would come in and take all your stuff, take all your grain. And you would have a very productive farmland. It would be growing there in your eyesight, and yet you wouldn't enjoy the productivity of the land. And so I've heard quotes up to 20 million people being subject to mass starvation within the Soviet orbit. 20 million people. The strong hand can be ruthless. It can be ruthless. So let's be a little bit more optimistic. Let's talk a little bit about the free hand. Because there is the free hand is conjoined with capitalism, that nasty word in American dialogue. And it's derived from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. A couple hundred years ago, a guy named Adam Smith, he was Scottish, and he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. It's very thick, and so if you want to tie into it, you're going to spend some time doing that. But he talks about the invisible hand, that's working behind all this commerce, all this industry, all these events that occur, entrepreneurial abilities and expressions of the people, the invisible hand. And take for a moment, and I think you can find this on YouTube. Take for a moment and look up Milton Friedman's description of the pencil, the number 2 lead pencil. And he goes into all the things that go into what produces a simple pencil, which when I was a kid, you could get a pencil for a nickel. And so basically it has that graphite in it, it has wood, it has erasure, and it's made up of like 6 or 8, 10 different things to make a pencil. And all these things, all these components have to come together and be produced so that you can have a pencil in your hand while you're taking notes in grade school. And so it's an amazing thing when you listen to it broken down like that by Milton Friedman and others. And so the invisible hand, well, hold it. What ruling elite put the pencil together? None. What put the pencil together? It was commerce. It was capitalism. It was people coming together, bringing what they had as far as industry, equipment, supplies, entrepreneurial ability to produce one pencil. So little Gary in second grade in St. Louis could sit down with a piece of paper and draw whatever I wanted to draw. So capitalism and the free hand are conjoined together. I don't know whether you can separate the two, because if you take away capitalism, something has to come in its place. You know, they say that nature abhors or hates a vacuum. There's something that comes in. So what comes in if you take capitalism out of the free hand structure? The ruling elites, they decide what's best. Something has to come in. And so what we need to have is a society where a free hand, a capitalistic free hand, can express itself. Now, I'm not talking about doing away with health and safety regulations. I'm not talking about a ruthless, monopolistic capitalism that gets out of hand. I'm talking about capitalism with a friendly face, where people come together and produce goods that allow us to have a good standard of living in a free society. Oh, that sounds like America in its original vision. So let's talk a little bit more about the free hand. In America, we have the expression, we the people. We the people implies a couple of things. One is that the government is accountable to us. And so you can see how things have evolved in American life, where we the people feel like we're accountable to the government. You know, we watch what we say. We're hesitant about what we post on social media. We want to not offend the wrong people. And so we, the people, feel accountable to the government, when the original vision was that the government would be accountable to us. And furthermore, to drive that point home further, they govern by consent of we the people. We govern, they're accountable to us, and we consent to be governed. If at any point we don't consent, then they lose their power to govern. And if you want to see that fleshed out, read the Declaration of Independence. I just summarized the Declaration of Independence. It is ruling by consent. If consent is lost due to tyranny, the people have the right, even the obligation, to form other ways in which to relate to each other, our government, so that we can have a just and orderly society. And if you haven't caught on to this yet, to me, a just and orderly society is synonymous with a free society where we can live freely amongst our fellow citizens. So, if we, the people, do not involve themselves in government, in self-government, it's just a cliche. If it's just a cliche, it has no real meaning. We, the people. Cliche, no real meaning, because we don't involve ourselves in the political will. And so something has to fill the gap. Something fills the vacuum. And so if we, the people, don't govern ourselves, something else has to govern us. And that opens the door for the power of ruling elites. And so I'm going to talk about a moment what I call an inherent contradiction, or it may be a conundrum, which I've talked about in the past. Think about your typical conservative person that was raised on the old red, white, and blue, freedom, liberty, the traditional values which governed our country before the welfare state was enacted, before the modern bureaucratic state was built to a level that it was able to dominate the lives of the citizens. But think about the values of conservatives. They're traditional, family, friends, faith, freedom, kind of like a live and let live attitude. And so, where is power in the midst of those values? Where is the passion for governing others? And so we have a bunch of people that we call conservatives that just want to be left alone. They want to raise their family. They want to have friends and have relationships with people they like. They want to enjoy their faith. They want to have a relationship with God according to their terms or according to what they believe God's terms to be. They want to be free. They do not want to stick their nose in other people's business. Very seldom do you see a conservative show up at like some of these town meetings where people are, basically deciding how their neighbors should live. I remember I saw one a few years ago about a young family had moved into Salem, Massachusetts, and it's the whole city, I think, is a historic district, so it has certain rules and regulations, and they wanted to replace a garage door which didn't work, an old garage door which didn't work, and they wanted to replace it with another garage door that they could actually get the garage door up and down so that they could get in and out of their garage without too much difficulty. The township meeting for the city of Salem was terrible. And so I don't know whether that happens all over America, but you're not going to see many conservatives tell their neighbor about how their garage door should be. It's more of a live and let live attitude. And so we are I'm a conservative, are at an inherent disadvantage when it comes to power, when it comes to government, because if you look at our list of priorities in living life, it doesn't fit in very high. And so we begrudgingly, almost resentfully, become we the people. And yet we need to have people embrace the concept of we the people cheerfully. As part of being an American citizen, you participate in government. Be a participant, because if you do not rule yourself, others will rule you. Let's take a moment here and talk about term limits. Term limits is generally accepted as favorable among the American people. But if you think about term limits, if you think about somebody only being able to serve in Congress or any political office for a couple terms, maybe 2 terms, that'd be about right according to my estimation. And so what it does, the advantage of what it does, is that the lobbyists aren't allowed to latch onto you like barnacles, and you become theirs, where you speak on their behalf, and you consult with them instead of we the people on governmental action. And so you figure that if we had term limits, that, the lobbyists wouldn't be able to encrust the elected officials in barnacles where they couldn't move without consulting them. But there's a flip side of this. There's an irresponsible flip side to this. And that is, you get new Congress people, get new representatives. They go to Jeff City, they go to Washington, they go to wherever. They go to your county courthouse because you'd be surprised how many counties have influence by lobbyists. You think lobbyists would ignore counties, but they don't. I'm in a county that has like 50,000 people in it, and we've got lobbyists influencing our policies. And so basically what happens is that if you're new, you don't know what you're doing. It takes a couple of terms to know what you're doing. And so who stands in the gap and says, I'll help you? I'll draft that legislation. The lobbyists. And so on the one hand, we're newly elected, and the lobbyists haven't learned how to control us yet, unless they were heavily involved in our election and they favored us heavily to help us win election. Or we don't know what we're doing, and the lobbyist comes along and say, we'll do that, we'll take care of that for you. So there's an inherent contradiction in all this to try and live the American life as a free person. The only answer that I have is that you have to participate in government for we the people, because if you do not govern yourself, others will govern for you. So let's take a compare and contrast for a moment. There are others who are desirous to rule you. It's just the way it is. They're power seeking. Some of them have benign motives. They just think they're the smartest guy in the room. Some of them are altruistic, that, they really want to help us. Like vice presidential candidate Tim Walz said the other day, he said one man's socialism is another man's neighborliness. And so you can kind of like put a good dressing on growing power within your community, within your country, by referring to it as neighborliness. Some power seekers are ruthless. It brings to mind the old saying, which I think has been proven time and time again. It's like on a spectrum. Power corrupts, and absolute power absolutely corrupts. So we have this continuum. Give something a little bit of power, it'll eventually become corrupt. I don't know why, I don't know how, it just happens. Power corrupts. And then you come to the other end of the spectrum. Absolute power absolutely corrupts. In other words, you are not going to be honestly and fairly dealt with as a citizen where there's a government that has absolute power. It is not going to happen. So anybody that tells you in flowery language that it is going to happen, it's just not going to happen. So let me finish with this. Who is best able to make the decisions that affect your life? You. Seems so simple. Who's the best decision maker for your life? You. Who is best situated to chart out the course of your life? You. And so if you are the best positioned to do these things that benefit you, why do you abandon we the people? Why do you not participate in self-government and allow other people to rule you further and further into your everyday life, where at some point we turn around and say to each other, how did we allow that to happen? You know, if you look at independent people versus dependent people, I don't know anybody that doesn't want to be independent. We all want to be independent. We all want to make our own choices, chart our own course, and be able to stand on our own 2 feet in life. I don't know anybody that wants to be weak and dependent upon others and unable to make decisions without some other power, some governing authority to make those decisions for you. And yet silently, quietly, day in and day out, we become more dependent on government. And we have to figure out a way to reverse the trend. God bless you. You all have a good day. We'll see you in the next episode of Liberty Observatory.